I'm Alfonso Morales.
I'm Harrison Reek.
I'm Daniel Meyer, and today we're interviewing Mrs. Lachenmann on December 1st, 2018 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Oscar Munoz is our videographer today. Good morning, Mrs. L. Thank you for doing this for us. We really appreciate it. First of all, I'd just like to start off. We'd like to tell us, if you will, about your childhood.
How far back do you want me to go?
Maybe from birth until...
Okay, I don't remember a thing about that.
Okay.
I do remember things when I was 3 years old. We went up to my father's cousin's farm.
Okay.
And I had a really nice time with, his children were older.
Okay.
And they made me a wreath to go around my head with wildflowers and let me choose the wildflowers.
Wow.
So I kept choosing them until the wreath was big enough, not for me, but for my older sister.
Oh, wow.
It was a big disappointment. They promised to do that again the next time we came.
What part of Wisconsin was this?
This was outside of a town named Askeaton,
Okay.
which is near Green Bay.
Now, what about your household?
There were 6 of us living at my house after my brother was born. My grandmother, my Irish grandmother, my father, my mother, my older sister, Mary, me, and my then younger brother, Ed, who is currently older than I am.
Okay. And then did your Irish grandmother actually speak Irish or speak Gaelic?
She knew a few Gaelic words, and she taught me a few, which I will not teach you.
Okay, okay. Now, did you guys all have separate rooms, or did you have to share rooms?
Oh, well, let's see. We had a living room, a dining room, a little cubby that could be turned into a bedroom, and 2 bedrooms. So
Okay.
that's 5.
Okay.
Do the math.
So you said you had 2 siblings. Were you closer to one of them, or?
I was in the enviable position of middle child. I was close to whichever one was practical to be close to.
So what neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up 4 blocks south of here, on 35th and Mount Vernon.
And how did your parents come, move here? Why Merrill Park?
My dad lived in Merrill Park for roughly half of his childhood. The other half he lived near Askeaton, and waffled back and forth. And at the time that my mom and dad got married, they stayed with my dad's parents. My grandparents technically owned the house, but my father was the only one working, and my father paid for the house. And when my grandmother was getting quite old, she deeded it over to him.
Okay, okay. And if you would you go into maybe your roots, like what nationality you were, like where your parents came from, where your great-grandparents came from?
My father was Irish, and his mother came over when she was 6 years old in the 1860s. So she was a lot older than he was. And her father came, where did he come? Oh, he came, I'm not sure where he came from.
Mm-hmm.
Probably Southern Ireland. My grandmother came from near Northern Ireland. And but my father's side came through Liverpool, so they lived there a generation or 2.
And when you say Northern Ireland, do you mean Ireland that's connected to the UK?
No, they're in the free part.
Okay.
It's just south of Northern Ireland.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and my Polish grandparents came from the same farming neighborhood that's northwest of Warsaw. And my grandfather came first, and he came through Baltimore. And then he went up and worked in New York for a while, and then came out here to Milwaukee, where he had a cousin. And in so doing, he missed meeting my grandmother's boat.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And she was sent back to Poland and had to come a second time. But she was good at persistence, so they eventually got here. My mom was born in Milwaukee. My dad, I'm not sure where he was born, but probably Milwaukee. Let's see, what else do I need to tell you?
I mean, maybe describe your Polish grandmother a little bit. What was she like?
Oh, Grandma liked horses.
Mm-hmm.
And when they moved to Milwaukee, they moved on the east side, and she didn't like it there very well, so they moved down to 37th and Ruby, where my grandfather actually built a house for them. My grandfather was very handy. My grandmother always wanted to have a garden. She wanted to have animals when they were on 37th and Ruby, which you know is sort of the inner city now. They had a cow. They could go down to Lincoln Creek and pick wild raspberries and strawberries. It was a nice place. They lost that house in the Depression. And then they moved out to 53rd and Hampton. When they were between Hampton and 2 blocks south, there were about 5 houses on that stretch. That's a couple of blocks. And they had chickens. And so playing with the chickens was not considered a good thing to do, which doesn't mean we didn't do it. It means we hoped we wouldn't get caught. But I had a photographer uncle who snuck out and caught my brother and I kicking the chicken wire to make the chickens go fluttering. And he didn't say a word. And the next week we were back up at Grandma's, and he did the one thing we loved the most. He brought the movies. And we were always stars of the movies. But they were usually Christmas or birthday parties or nice events, and tacked on the end of it was a picture of Ed and me kicking the chicken wire. Nobody ever told us we were not supposed to do that. They understood. We understood at that point. And we never did it again.
And just to clarify, this is your maternal grandmother?
Correct.
And your paternal grandmother lived with you in Merrill Park?
Yeah, by the time I was born, my grandfather had died. He constantly jaywalked. And the one day he was not jaywalking, and in the crosswalk where he belonged, somebody hit him. Mm. And he died before he knew he had grandchildren. So I never met him.
So going back to the Depression in Milwaukee, was that was the Depression finished by the time you were born?
Technically, yes.
But did you notice any of the effects?
I noticed a whole lot of people telling me all about it, how horrible it was. And the fact that my mother, when she would give me her history, she told me about the fact that she lost 2 jobs. One of them was a temporary job, and that's the one she met my father at. And one of them was a job she held for quite a period of time. But the owner's wife decided she could do everything my mother was doing. And my mother got kicked out of that job. My mom had one other good job where she was manning the books and taking the money to the bank. So when she'd get her paycheck, then she would take the money to the bank, deposit it, and then hand them her check, and she never was not paid. other people at that company were.
And what companies were these?
I can't tell you the names.
Okay.
One was a soda company and one was gold plating.
Okay.
And they worked with many of the Catholic parishes for all the gold chalices and stuff like that.
Okay. Interesting.
Where she met my dad, that was essential industry in the Second World War, because it was slaughtering animals.
Could you go into that a little bit more?
That was, I know the company there, because he still worked there when I was a kid. That was Equity Co-op, and it was a loose confederation of farmers who were bringing their cows and pigs and whatever to be slaughtered, mostly beef. So it was mostly the cows. We go up a little further. In 1947, you boys may have heard about the snowfall that we had in late January that year. And the whole city was shut down for days. My dad, we didn't live too far from where he worked. That was down on 13th and Canal. And when he came home, he had to walk home because there was absolutely no way that the buses were running, and we didn't have a car. And the next morning, the whole city was shut down, and I was looking out our front living room window onto 35th Street, where I could see somebody out cross-country skiing, and I wanted cross-country skis. I did get them eventually, but it was a long time later. And he went down to the stockyards because the animals hadn't been slaughtered the day before, and he walked all the way down and all the way back so that they would have water and food. And he would not take us with him, and that was probably a good decision, but I resented it then. We wanted to go and see how high the snow was everywhere.
Were there a lot of farms in Milwaukee back then?
In Milwaukee County, yes. A lot of people had gardens, but for farms, yeah, southern Milwaukee County had farms probably into the 60s.
And you said, were there farms down where your father worked?
No.
Or just pastures with animals?
Oh, no, they were just in pens.
Oh, okay.
Because they were brought there for a purpose, and that was lunch and dinner next week.
Okay, okay. And so
That wasn't his job. He was the office manager, but
Okay.
he also grew up part-time on a farm. So he knew how to take care of the animals.
Was that in the town we were talking earlier in northern Wisconsin?
Central Wisconsin, Green Bay is central.
Okay. And going back to the snowfall,
Mhm.
were there any snow plows?
Any snow plows? Yes. Adequate snow plows? Absolutely not. That's when Milwaukee learned a really good lesson on you need snow plows, you need the kind that vacuum up and push the snow into dump trucks, which you could then take down to the Milwaukee River or the lake and dump the snow. By the time they got all of that cleaned up, it was quite a bit later. It took a while. Well, of course, they had to get the plows. But they never were that short-sighted again.
And then, how many inches would you estimate?
You'd have to estimate, anyone would. It was up in the teens, maybe about 18 over the snowfall, but that didn't happen on one day. It started on a Wednesday night. Thursday, everybody had a day off from school, but we had that already planned because that was exam season, and the exams finished on Wednesday. So Thursday and Friday were days off from school. Saturday, there were still mountains of snow, particularly on the corners. On Sunday, we were able to go to Mass over at St. Rose's, which is in your backyard. And Monsignor Clark, who was the pastor, got up at our Mass and said, all those public school kids got a day off. They got 2 days off, but there's no school tomorrow. So those of us who went to church got the message early.
Going back to your neighborhood, can you touch on the safety of your neighborhood? Was it commonplace to leave your doors unlocked at night? Did you guys really worry about that at all?
We habitually locked our doors, not because we felt the neighborhood was so dangerous, but simply because it was a good habit.
And do you know, did your neighbors at all?
Not all of my neighbors did.
What?
And to my knowledge, none of them got robbed. I still lock my doors where I live now.
What would you say the, I guess, rougher part of the cities were when growing up for you?
There are things that your parents could not do with you that were commonplace. By the time we learned how to cross the street safely, we could go to Merrill Park Playground, and we did all summer long. That was our destination. The nice part about it was there was a Merrill Park library that was right on the edge of the park. And so we would take our books back to the library, deposit them in our cards with the librarian, go play. When noontime came, we'd go over to the library, pick up some books, and go home. It was a particularly hot day. We'd sit at home and read, and we'd sit on the back steps inside the house. And everybody'd be reading. My mom would be reading, all of us kids were, and I don't know what my grandmother was doing. But there were a number of things we could do on the playground. We had swings, we had monkey bars. We had some things you could climb on that were not monkey bars and slide your hands across. It was like a ladder that was parallel to the ground. And that was, and it had the rungs in it too, so you could either go across sliding or you could go across hand by hand.
What was the smell of the Merrill Park Library?
The smell?
The smell.
Books. we had a favorite librarian, and she would just make us feel comfortable. They did not ever let us go down to the basement except once. The basement did have a distinct odor of mildew.
So you mentioned some of your hobbies of going to the park and reading books and stuff. Did you have any other hobbies that filled up your time?
My brother and I loved to ride buses. As I said, we didn't have a car, and so my dad had a bus pass. And on Saturdays, if he was going no place, and if the folks that lived downstairs from us, because we lived in a duplex, if they weren't going anyplace, Ed and I would take the 2 passes, and we would go bus riding just to see what Milwaukee looked like. At one time, I believe I knew every bus route, where it went, and they had such things as zone fares, and our passes didn't go into the zone fares. So we'd have to stop at that point. And we didn't have the money to be getting back on the bus.
What parts of Milwaukee would you go towards? Would you go to?
Different days, different parts. We went north, we went south, we went east, we went west.
And your parents didn't have any rules about where you?
No, we pretty well told them where we were going on a given day.
Mm-hmm.
But we were 7 and 8 years old.
Wow.
Can you imagine kids being allowed to do that? Their parents would be sued or threatened with taking away the kids. Yeah, we had a lot more freedom than you did.
Speaking of just buses and transportation in general, was the 35th Street Viaduct?
Yeah,
there
yeah.
Back then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It was well established. I don't remember a time when it wasn't.
Okay.
And we'd walk across there. If we were going to see a movie, there was a Grace Theater on National. And they had usually a Western, a cartoon or two, the news, and something that was a cereal, so that they'd get you back next week.
Now, you mentioned you love buses. Do you ever get a chance to experience the original Milwaukee trolleys?
Oh, yeah.
And you still prefer the buses over the trolleys, or?
Yes, I really did. When you're saying buses, though, we had a trolley bus.
Oh.
And then we had, like the Wells Street streetcar. I think that was the last one that was in. 35th Street had a streetcar before it had the buses. When I was going to high school, because I went quite a ways, I got on the bus at 35th and Mount Vernon, and as I was walking down the stairs to get to the street, I would see a bus coming, and I could just kind of speed up and get to it. Or sometimes I'd see it already leaving that corner. But I would see another bus behind it, and a couple of blocks back, and another bus behind that one, a couple of blocks back. There was no such thing as waiting for a bus for very long, unless you were on a specific outlier kind of bus. The 13s, which were on St. Paul, we picked it up on 35th and St. Paul, and went over and went down east on Clybourne. That one didn't run quite as frequently, but the 35th Street bus you could rely on.
Have you ridden on a bus recently, anytime?
Define recently.
In the past, I don't know, 20 years?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And how would you compare, like, I guess the newer buses, or the newer, transportation compared to when you were growing up?
You missed the bus and you're waiting. It's not anywhere close to the frequency, but there were an awful lot of people who had no cars, and the public transportation was a very busy place. You seldom didn't get a seat, but if we went out to my Polish grandparents, we would take the 35th Street bus up to the where they had a central location for buses, and then we could pick up one of two buses, because one of them went west on Hampton and one of them went east on Hampton, but west on Fond du Lac. And then they just made a circle. And so we'd take whichever bus came first, because we weren't waiting for the next one.
What was your favorite part of Milwaukee to go visit on a bus?
The lakefront. We also walked down there once or twice. And sometimes we just took the bus down and then walked, like, from Wisconsin Avenue to Center Street, and then took a bus home down to 35th Street, and 35th Street was the artery.
What was the lakefront like back then? Was it as popular as it is today?
It was popular, but with a significantly smaller population. It's more crowded now. When you go down past, what's the beach on the end of North Avenue? Bradford Beach. You see them really crowded. A lot of people are playing volleyball, and there was no such thing as playing volleyball down there. It was swimming, or at least getting your toes wet. The lake was still cold.
Was the war memorial?
Oh, there was a train station, and then there was the war memorial, but not the new part of it.
Would you, if you were coming down from Merrill Park, would you be dropped off at that train station, or would the bus go all the way down?
It didn't go down to the lake. You had to do some walking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever go inside that train station?
Yeah, just to see it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember it well. I was disappointed when they took it away. But they're now using what was the train tracks for people running and walking. And so at least they've made pretty good use of it and making trails there for people to exercise a little.
So, if you would, were there any other hobbies that you enjoyed as a child? like playing the piano?
I took piano lessons from the time I was 8 until I was 18. I had a teacher who objected to the way I had my hands, and she took a pencil, a sister or whomever, right across my fingers. I walked out. I got punished for that. I never saw the justice in it, but I did have to apologize to her. And I continued taking lessons from her. And when we were in 7th grade, a friend of mine and I played a duet, Stars and Stripes Forever. And it was very well received. And then when we were in 8th grade, they wanted us to play it again, and I wanted us to play a piano duo that was a little harder and I thought classier. So that one required, it wasn't a duet, it was a duo, and so we had to have 2 pianos. And they just fixed it so there weren't 2 pianos, so Katie and I played our Stars and Stripes Forever again, and everybody was still happy with it.
And you mentioned you played the Stars and Stripes Forever.
Mhm.
What was kind of the patriotic feeling back then? Was it very, were there a lot of marching bands?
I don't know how many marching bands, because I wouldn't be seeing them. And I wouldn't have access to any way of finding them. There was no such thing as instant knowledge of something. Like this morning, former President Bush died. We know that today. It was just yesterday when he died. I think it was yesterday. They said late at night, so that's vague. No communication like that. Communication is way, way faster.
And then going back to your nuns, what were some of the disciplinary things that they would do? Was it just tapping you on the hand, or?
Well, she cracked me on the hand with the pencil. But that's the only time I participated in any of that kind of discipline. However, we had a kid in our classroom when I was in 7th and 8th grade who was at least 2 years older than the oldest one in our class. Obviously, he had not been too successful. And he was constantly reprimanded and sometimes struck with something. I was on the other side of the room. I plead innocent.
Coming back to your neighborhood, I know that the Zeidler family grew up close to where you lived. Do you remember them growing up, or do you have any interactions with them?
No, I didn't personally know them.
Or what did you know? Did you know what were you told, or what do you remember about them?
I remember Frank Zeidler as mayor, and he was had a good reputation, and I think he did a lot for the city. He was out by 1960. 1960 was the first election I got to vote for anybody in. You had to be 21 then. You guys can do it sooner. And I recommend it for all of you.
What about Carl? Did you know?
I knew of him because he was, I think he was the mayor in 40, and he left to participate in the Second World War. So, and he didn't come back.
Do you think that in the elections back then, especially for mayor, do you think a lot of those ideals are still sought out today, or do you think it's changed at all?
Oh, yeah, it's changed at all. Oh, my goodness. It's changed in your lifetime. Just listen to what is said about President Bush, because they're doing a lot on him and telling you a lot about him. And that was only in the 90s, early 90s and late 80s. It's changed since then dramatically. From when I first voted, it has changed in that the numbers that we associated with a normal voting day have not been reached, the percentage numbers have not been reached in modern times. And we had paper ballots, and they had to count paper ballots. They didn't have a little machine that counts them for you. It's much more efficient now, but it's not as popular. People voted. When we ever wanted something to happen, like we did have neighbors to the south of us, one of whom was a pain in the neck or a pain in the yard, because she thought of her back porch as a place to get her garbage and throw it down toward her garbage cans. It didn't always make it there, and sometimes it made it a little too far, which was called our yard. And so we put on some kind of gloves, whatever, and carefully threw the garbage back into her yard. We also asked for the health department to come and reprimand them, which they did, because in upstairs and downstairs, at that point, there were 9 voters. They were not going to risk 9 votes in an aldermanic election, so the alderman would snap to very fast.
Do you remember kind of I know aldermen have a reputation
Mm-hmm.
to not be the best of people. Do you remember your alderman at all in Merrill Park?
I don't remember the name. It might have been Quinn, but I'm not sure. In any case, he was somebody my mom and dad knew, but he was out of my age range. Wasn't going to school with me or anything.
And then what did you, I know you say you voted in 1960. What
Mm-hmm.
did you look for in a candidate, if you'd be willing to share?
I looked for somebody, and yes, and I'll even tell you who I voted for in spite of the fact that it's a secret ballot. I looked for somebody who I thought would be good for the country. And I voted for Kennedy.
Or were there mayor elections that year too?
Yes, because they didn't shift them until relatively recently. But I don't remember who I voted for. I don't remember who I voted for as mayor.
Okay.
And I think the Kennedy one was solidified in my mind because of his assassination.
At what age did you start getting into, I guess, athletics? I know you mentioned you did cross country.
I wanted to cross country.
All right.
I never did very much with athletics because St. Rosie's did not have much in the way of an athletic program. And the athletics that were available at that time were not very interesting. And of course, I did not play football, or I could hit a ball if I was playing baseball. We did do that on Merrill Park. And there just wasn't much in the way of organized sport for girls. You know, girls, that wasn't their thing. Maybe you could dance. I never could dance.
And so when do you think that started, I guess, changing, where they started implementing more sports for girls and stuff like that?
Late 60s, early 70s.
60s, early 70s?
Mhm.
And that was at the high school level or college levels? Or
It came into all of them.
Okay.
Of course, my high school had a terrible way of dealing with athletics. Gym classes we only had to take for 2 years, and I was celebrating the fact that I was going to be a junior soon. And we had a basketball game of sorts. You know how there are 5 people on the, well, we had 6. And 3 of us were restricted to being shooters, and 3 of us on the other side were the guards. And that was our team. And I thought, the first day when we did this, I played guard all of the first time that it was there, I thought the second time we played, I'd get to be a forward and I could shoot. Well, that didn't happen. Once we were in these slots, we stayed in the slot. So all of the time that we were playing basketball, none of us on my side could shoot. We could steal the ball, we could send it to our teammates. It was not a very satisfactory way of doing things, but for the final, she said, we're going to do 10 free throws, and whoever gets the most will get, I don't remember if it was a B or an A for sure. Loretta was the queen of shooting baskets and always a forward. So she got up first and she did 8 out of the 10. I had the good fortune of having a perfectly good day for me, which was not a perfect day. But the first one went in, the second one went in, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and I missed on 10. That was the most fun I had playing basketball at DS. And then my teacher, this was when we were signing up for classes, she came up to me and she says, I hope you're thinking of taking PE next year. I said, no way. So I said, I like to shoot. I'm not sure she got the message, but it isn't fair to not give everyone a chance. And I had given her a chance, and she didn't want it, so I didn't want to have anything more to do with her. And I had plenty of things to occupy myself with.
Kind of going back to I just want to go back to, you said that, was there any organized baseball that you remember here over at Merrill Park?
Okay, there was the library and the playground. And then over here, there was a baseball diamond. And there, all summer long, there were baseball games that were organized. And my parents used to run down there and sit on the bleachers and watch them. And so after the lights went out at the playground at 9 o'clock, we would join them. So that was a nice amenity to have in the neighborhood. It brought the neighbors together.
Do you remember anything maybe about baseball in Milwaukee in general? Like the Milwaukee Braves? Or
The Milwaukee Braves came, that was wonderful. It was quite convenient. At that time, you could walk down St. Paul, and you could get to the Menominee River, and there was a little bridge over it. You walked over the little bridge, and you were in the backyard of the stadium. So we could go down there, and we would watch, and we'd, on occasion, even spend a little money and go sit in the bleachers. And one day my uncles took me and my brother and all of the uncles and my dad were going to go to this game. And my dad couldn't go, so I got to go instead because the ticket was already bought. And this was in the real place to watch the game from. And so one of my uncles assumed I knew absolutely nothing about baseball. And so he very kindly told me something about something I knew perfectly well. And so the next time play came up that might require a little bit of explanation, I explained it to him, and then he didn't bother me anymore. But yeah, I used to know all the names of them. I knew who was on first base, Joe Adcock. I still remember those. Eddie Matthews was on third. Yeah. Hank Aaron was outfield. So.
I'm sure it was everyone was talking about it, I'm sure, in the whole city. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And of course Warren Spahn and Lou Burdett pitching, if you boys don't know that.
And do you remember when they won the World Series in '56?
I watched one of the games. My father sent out for tickets. It was just like a shot in the dark, and he got a pair. So he and my brother went to the first game, and my mom and I went to the one that was a pitcher's duel. And the first game was a little wilder and had more in the way of score. But, of course, they did win. That was the year they did win. And, of course, it was fun to be going there.
What were some of your memories of County Stadium, and especially in comparison now to Miller Park?
I've been to County Stadium more than I've been to Miller Park. So, for whatever that's worth. So.
It was a good environment though, not too crazy or any violence at the games?
With the Braves?
Yeah.
Of course not. I don't think there was as much tailgating or drinking. You know, water was fine. But that's not all that goes on there now.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the game you went to was a pitcher's duel.
Mhm.
Who were the two pitchers that were facing off? Or the two starting pitchers?
Do you expect me to know even who we won from?
Or
I don't remember. It was one of Spahn or Burdette. I don't remember. But my mom and I said we saw the better game because it really was kind of tense. And of course, a home run could have tied it up if it were from the other side. And if there were a runner on, we could have lost. And of course, but the pitchers just kept pitching. Really, they were on. It was a good day.
Mrs. L, we're going to take a quick break.
Okay.
So can you tell us about some of the World War II artifacts you brought with you today?
My mother was a volunteer, and every family had these war ration card books, and you got little points. And these were some of the points. These are the only points I have. And this one was my dad's, and his was the only one who had anything left in it. So you went to the office of, boy, it's on here somewhere, Price Administration. And in order in the Second World War to get such things, you know, luxuries as meat, butter. I don't know if sugar had points, but I know that the meat and butter did, and that was a sore point with a lot of people because it was hard enough to get meat, let alone you had to have the points to be permitted to buy it. As I said earlier, my dad belonged to a company, well, not belonged to, worked for a company that slaughtered cows and whatever. And so we always had an access to a little extra meat, which was stored in the freezer at the drugstore that was on the corner of 35th and St. Paul, because we didn't have any such luxury as a freezer. We had an ice box. Any of you ever see an ice box in motion? What was going on with it? You had to have somebody bring the ice. So you had a little card, and on the card there were two sides, and each side was split in two. And so you could put the card in your window, and the iceman would look at it, and it would say 25, 50, 75, or 100. It'd be the one that was up. And he would bring that amount of ice in and put it into your receptacle for it that belonged to the ice box, which was on top of the area where you could keep your food cold. You certainly could not keep ice cream. You certainly could not bring home meat, if you could get it, and freeze it. But it did a pretty good job of keeping milk and stuff like that cold. So anyhow, these things were gold, and I have the whole family here, all 6 of us. And so we got those, and my mom would always be asked by acquaintances, I'm not going to dignify it by calling them friends, who thought that since she had 6 books, that she should share some of those. And then they could have a better way of living. And of course, my mother said there's a one-to-one correspondence between the number of books I have and the number of people who eat at my table. So she wasn't very forthcoming with that. We had another point of access for something that was meat, in that my grandmother still had lots of chickens, and we could bring home chickens some nights. She didn't give it to us too often because she had 6 children and she had to split them up. So everybody took a turn. She also had fresh eggs, and I don't know if eggs were rationed, but I do know that you weren't supposed to do such things with sugar as make jam, but they gave you a pretty generous amount of sugar that you could have, and my mom never cooked with too much sugar. So what we did do with that was we had enough sugar that we could make some jam. And my grandmother had all kinds, this is my Polish grandmother, she had all kinds of fruit trees available. So we had cherries, and we had peaches. The peaches didn't last long, but the cherries were there every year. Peach trees don't do well in this climate. So that was something that everybody needed, was the ration book and the ability to pay for the meat. The other thing that happened in the war that was of concern to my parents was the lack of coffee. And coffee was something that you never saw on the shelf at the grocery store. But I showed Dan where our grocery store was as we were driving here. And my mom would go across the street to the grocery store because that's basically where it was. And when the woman who ran it was packing the groceries for her, she'd have a bag out, and there would be something in the bottom of the bag. And when my mom got home, she had a pound of coffee there, and of course she was paying more than the groceries she had assembled. So when the first I remember about going to that store was when you came in, you did not have a cart. You would just get whatever you could hold, walk up and leave it on the counter, and then go back and get the rest of what you wanted. The butcher was a separate enterprise. He had the back of the store, and you bought your meat there and then paid him. So we did have an A&P store that was about a mile from home, and if we went there and got groceries, which was pretty rare, we would walk up to the store, we would get our groceries, and then we would take the bus back if there was one coming. If there wasn't, then you could probably walk home easier. So that was a little difficult to do grocery shopping than it is nowadays.
At the grocery store during the war, did you notice, I'm sure the shelves were a lot less packed, but also were the prices hiked up, or?
I don't know that much about the pricing. I was 7 years old when the war ended, and I was not in charge of finances.
But do you remember like the store being a lot less crowded, or?
Oh, there was that store. There was one on the corner across the street from it, and there was one a block away east of us. So there were really a lot of choices. It was neighborhood shopping.
Okay.
It wasn't like going to Pick and Save. And you didn't fight for parking because almost nobody was driving. Oh, gas was another thing that was rationed. Going back to that. And that was a reason for many people to sell their cars. Basically, you had 3 gallons of gas, and I don't remember if that was for a week or for a month.
Would you relate that to kind of off topic, but later the oil crisis in the 70s, I believe?
Well, by then people had cars.
Okay.
That was a whole different world.
Yeah.
The cars started coming back in maybe 46, 47, 48, and many people bought cars. We did not have a car until I was 18. My dad had one in past life, but I think when my grandfather wasn't working too, it really wasn't affordable for him to have a car.
Was your father in the war, or did you have any family members, distant or close family members that were in the war?
My mother's 3 brothers were in the war. My dad was a whole lot older than I was, and he would have not been anybody that would be brought into the war. No drafting would be allowed because he was 39 years old. He was 41 years old when we got into it. He had 3 children, and he was working in what was referred to as essential industry in the meat slaughtering and packing and stuff like that. So he didn't go in, but my 3 uncles did. 2 of them were in Europe. That was my youngest uncle and the second youngest. The second youngest was a mechanic, and so he stayed out of the actual war zone. He was always putting the equipment back together, and he was a very good mechanic. My youngest uncle was an officer, so but he was a lieutenant, and lieutenants led into the fighting. Fortunately, they both came back. My oldest uncle went to the Pacific, and he had the absolute worst possible case of seasickness that you are going to ever survive. Yeah, but he did survive it. Every time he got on a ship, he could not eat. When he came home, he was as tall as when he left. He was 6'3", and he weighed probably 100 pounds. Now, you all can figure that out, that he actually looked like a skeleton with skin on. And the first time I saw him at my grandmother's, I was just afraid of him. He did not look like ordinary people did, and I was 7. The next week we went back. Grandma had slaughtered a couple of chickens, fed him up. I probably gained 5 pounds. And I was prepared to see him, and he looked so much better. And then he went on, and he lived until 1990. So my second uncle, all of them survived the war. All of them lived at least to 1990. And the last of them died in 2010. Well, we had, at school, they sold war bonds. And for 25 cents, you could have a stamp. And when you assembled the right number of them, that was $18.75 worth, then you could get a $25 bond, and it would be paid to you. The $25 would be paid to you in 10 years. So it would sit there and earn interest, and that was a way that the government was borrowing money from its citizens, and it was a very patriotic thing to bring in your quarter and get your stamp. And so we were not really wealthy. My grandmother gave each of us kids $1 out of the rent money from the house every month. So once a month we would buy a stamp. And we had a few bonds. I still had those when I got married. But after a while they don't earn money anymore, so then you can turn them in.
And then can you describe the feeling of patriotism there was during the war?
Starting from grade school with the stamps. Everybody that I knew was pretty much behind it. They did not want to get into the war in the first place. But when Pearl Harbor was bombed, they didn't have any other choice. So that was the start of the war, with us in it. Needless to say, there were people in Europe who wanted us in a whole lot earlier. And FDR was not having any of that.
Post-World War II, what was, I guess, the general energy like?
the general energy.
In terms of parades, celebrations?
It was celebrated.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was considered an absolute must. And people, VJ Day, VE Day, which was in May of 45, we were permitted to do a lot of yelling and screaming and noise making at home. And then we went out, my father borrowed a car, and we went out to see some friends of my parents who had lost a son in the war. They were glad the war had ended, but of course they wanted their son to come home. My grandmother got all her sons back. So after we were there, they didn't have any kids that are our ages, so we were not too thrilled to be there. But then we went up to Grandma's, where it was commonplace to be, and we knew our way around, and there were fields out there to run in and play in, and it was fun. But the general happiness was that we were out of the war in Europe, and of course I expected fully that my uncles would come home immediately, the two that were in Europe. And I was told that wasn't necessarily a fact if the war went on any longer in the Pacific area. They would be sent there. However, the war did end in August that year. So, and I don't remember VJ Day, because no special perks with that one.
Do you remember when General MacArthur came to Milwaukee?
Absolutely.
Can you describe that a little bit?
Well, he flew in, and he was coming from the airport, which was where it is now. And they planned a route for him, and it came right down 35th Street. So we got a really nice view. We waved, and I think he waved back. But we didn't have to go to the parade because we had our own private parade. So that was neat.
What was the atmosphere in the city when he came? Was it very energetic?
Well, they did have a nice parade for him. People were divided on him because he had left the Philippines, and he left a good many American soldiers there. And they had a nickname for him. He was Dugout Doug. And there were a lot of people who didn't like him. But of course he came home a victor, so there were a lot of people who did like him.
In terms of, obviously, no social media back then or anything, so stuff like that, rumors like that, how did they come to be? Through newspapers or just general talks among people?
Letters.
Letters.
People wrote them. My parents wrote letters to each of my uncles, but they would send one letter to maybe John, and then he would pass it on to his brothers, or one letter to Jerry would be the next one, and then to Kay. And they would all circulate the letters because my parents didn't write just about family. They wrote about what was going on in the U.S. My father did some airplane trips to Washington, D.C. for conferences during the war. And of course we wanted to go with him, but that was not allowed. It probably made me want to travel more.
If you will, would you please talk about your education?
Starting in kindergarten at St. Rose, I had an absolute lovely people teaching me. They were the same Cincinnati Dominicans who taught at Dominican High School. I don't think there are any of them left now at the school. But they were really mostly very good teachers. I had some annoyances there, but I had teachers that I absolutely loved also. And when I was in first grade, I knew how to tell time, but obviously that wasn't a general case. And when Sister Tharla started to teach time, my hand was up all the time, and I was answering correctly, so she quit calling on me. And so my next move was, when I knew I was putting my hand up and not getting called on, I did this. And then she called on me. And she didn't get fooled twice. She was one smart person. And so the next thing I did was I looked for the window. I got the same result. She called on me because I was obviously not paying attention, but I was able to answer the questions, and then I knew that didn't work, so I knew I had to find a new strategy. And so she was holding a conversation with one of the girls. Her name was Judy. And they were talking back and forth, and neither one of them understood the other one. So then I put my hand up, and I translated Judy for Sister Tharla and Sister Tharla for Judy. And that's what she would call on me for every time. So, and that's when I decided I'd become a teacher. So I was kind of young, but I kept with it. My fourth grade teacher I had a little war with because she wanted us to read first grade books from the school library. So I went down to the library and balked at getting one of those, and she finally, everyone else had a book, and she finally made me take one. And I said, please, can I bring my own library book next week for library day? She said yes. So now I had friends at the Milwaukee Library at Merrill Park. And so I went to my librarian there, and I said, can I read this book and tell Sister, whoever her name was, that you recommended it to me? And so I gave her the whole story of having to take these baby books. And she said, yes, but that doesn't mean you are open to reading in the teenage group. You will go back to where you belong. And I said, oh yeah, I don't need to do this constantly. But this was one there, it was a series of books where Maud Hart Lovelace was the teacher, the writer. And they had 4 of them that were before high school, and this book was kids getting into high school. And I wanted to read it, and she didn't want me to read it. However, she went along with me. So I brought the book, and I went down to the library and turned in my book from the previous week, and just reached down on the shelf and picked up the first book that came to hand, sat down and read it. And the rest of the kids now got their books, and we were going upstairs, and Sister said, well, since you've read that, do you want to get another one? And I said, no, I brought my library book, as you said I could. So came into the room, we all sat down to read our books. I got mine out. I didn't say a word to her, but I knew she was going to be coming over to see what I was reading. So she did. And she looked at it, and she said something to the effect of, should you be reading this? I said, well, the librarian recommended it to me. I'll give you her name. She didn't take the name. She didn't call the librarian. She didn't call. She just believed I had set that up, and she was smart enough to know that. So that was one of the ones I had trouble with. And I thought she was at least 85 years old at that time. So, and I'm sure she wasn't really, but she was just not doing what I had in mind. And so then I went through the rest of there was another thing there that we would never do nowadays. When I was in 7th and 8th grade, they would take kids down to Marquette to have them have dental checks.
At the university?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes. Well, they have a dental school there. I think they still do. And they line them up, and 2 of us would go, kids, with the little kids. We'd have about half a dozen first graders that we were taking down to the dentist. And we took them down on the city bus. And it cost a whole nickel to get on the bus. Yeah, those were the good old days. So we took them down. They had their dental exams and whatever else came out of that, I don't know. And we'd take them back to school. There were no such things as parental notes signed that I know of. My parents did not know we were doing that until after the fact, and they didn't object. So, everything worked out well. But it's just another example of how things have changed and are so different now. And so when I was in 8th grade, there were a lot of tests because the Catholic schools were trying to get people to come to them. And Holy Angels, Mercy, and Divine Savior all had scholarship exams. So I took the Holy Angels one, and they offered me a year's scholarship. And my friend Katie took the Mercy one, and she got 4 years. And then DS came on, and they said they'd have a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1. So I went to DS and got their 4-year one. So I had 4 years at Divine Savior, which was a very, very good school, and was very, very good for me. And Holy Angels was not exactly pleased. They had plans for me that I didn't really want to participate in. I liked math and science a whole lot better than I liked English and writing. I liked history. But they were bound and determined that I was going to get involved in English really, really much. And they finally talked to me about the fact that I only had the one and how I made my choice. And I just told them I had 1 year there and I had 4 years at DS. And they said, well, we would have given you 4 years. I said, not up front, you didn't. Because I would never have taken the DS test. That was a long way to go to school. Holy Angels was quite close.
How did you take the streetcar to Divine Savior?
We were now in buses. So things get changed around a lot. So I took a bus out to 55th and the Capitol, where there were a cluster of girls who got on the school bus. And the school bus was run by Divine Savior at that time. The next 3 years, they ran a series of buses as Divine Savior was just getting started when I was there. And as more population was there, they needed more busing than what the one little school bus would manage. So I went again. But the first year that they did that, they sent me out to a tour of the city. And we went all the way east into Whitefish Bay and Sherwood and eastern Milwaukee City. And that took a long time, so I made a deal with them that I would pay them the difference between the bus payments that we had to make and my city bus. So I had a bus pass, so I could use it on the weekends too. But then I had to go out to 55th and Capitol again, and they picked me up there. And of course, I had to figure that one out by myself, how to get there with the least amount of time and the most probability that I was going to make it to the bus.
What were classes like in high school?
High school classes, we had all kinds of good ones.
What were your favorites?
Math. You knew that, didn't you? I liked some of the social studies ones. I even liked some of the English ones. I liked history a lot. So science was good. They didn't have a 4th year of math for me. So they signed me up for University of Wisconsin by mail. You know, didn't have things like computers and stuff like that at that time. Computers were in existence, but nobody commonly had them. And many businesses did not. They came into Northwestern Mutual, where I later worked, and that was just about the time I was leaving there to go to Marquette U. So that was late 50s.
Were you around when DS and HA merged?
As around being in Milwaukee County, yes. As being involved in it, no.
Okay.
And of course, I always call what I did, I went to DS. And I don't even remember exactly when that was.
Okay. And speaking of Marquette University, that's where you went to college?
Correct.
And what did you study there?
Major math, minors history and chemistry.
How popular was Marquette University back then?
I think I'm going to not exactly answer that. There were a lot of people there that I knew because of where I had come from. I first worked for 2 years, and while I was working for those 2 years, I went to night school at Marquette. And so by the time 2 years had elapsed, I had money in the bank. I had enough money that I thought with working summers, I would be able to pay for the rest of my education there, because I had assembled what made me entitle a sophomore when I went back full time, but was a little short of a full 1 year. So I did finish in those 3 years, and it took putting in, well, by 5 years out I had my degree and I had 2.25 years of work experience.
Where did you work?
Northwestern Mutual was the first place, well, it was not the first place, it was the first full-time job I had. And they had some rules about women. If you were engaged, the best thing to do with your engagement ring was leave it home, because they wouldn't hire somebody who was engaged. If you started working for them, got engaged, and got married, at one time, for just a few months, I think they asked you to leave when you were married. And then they got a little bit of backlash from that. And they went to, well, you can stay until you're 5 months pregnant, and then you must leave. And, it was just a whole different world. Now, they treat you like people. But then it was kind of questionable.
What was your job at Northwestern Mutual?
I was in the actuarial department in the change calculation division. And what I did, well, I had 3 different jobs in there. First of all, I was a messenger. Everybody was when they came in. And that was probably the most fun of it, because you walked around the building delivering things here and there, and you were kind of free. Secondly, I did typing, and I did take a typing class at DS, so I could type. And I learned that job, and then I asked to be moved into the calculator. And you now couldn't quite afford the premiums on it. You went to a lower premium thing, which would be just ordinary life, and you had to get things adjusted. And in order to do that, you would match up what should be your, assuming you started on the day that you actually bought the policy, what would have been the balance that they would have in would stay, and the rest of the money would come out to you. So they demanded a medical exam, because they were now taking more risk with their money. If it was the other way around, and you were going from a lower one, like the ordinary life, up to a 20 pay life, then you would owe them a lot of money because, well, depending on how many years there were to go on. But you had to figure it out one way or the other. So that was kind of fun. And one day, when they'd get in a whole trust, because companies would buy for their employees, you usually got a day of overtime, and overtime meant something to me because I was putting all that money away toward college. So I would work on those. And if I volunteered to work on one, I always got to do it because I knew how to type the reports and I knew how to do the stuff. So it's always a good thing to pick up as much as you can and as many different jobs that you can at least function at. The moral of the story is.
I know you talking about Northwestern Mutual kind of made us think of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Mm-hmm.
I know it was a big deal when it came to Port here in Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm.
Were you there to see it?
I don't remember seeing
I
it.
remember seeing it.
No, but I do remember when it went down in Lake Superior, the boat, yeah, the ship.
How did you commute to Northwestern Mutual when you were living in Merrill Park?
Route 13. You went from 35th and St. Paul. The bus turned and went north a block, and you went all the way down on Clybourne Street until you had to go over to Michigan. And then you went over, and that route went right in front of the railroad station that was there. And you were a block from Northwestern.
From the original building with the large columns, correct?
Mm-hmm. Oh, they didn't have the other one yet. They didn't get their need for it. They didn't even have computers when I joined.
How was commuting changed, especially going to and from work with the freeway system and the Market Interchange for you?
Made no difference at all. I didn't have a car. However, it changed my life in a whole lot of ways to have the freeway system where it was, because there were people who lived down in the valley, and they were all gone by the time I was graduating 8th grade. They couldn't be living there anymore. And so a lot of people, that included a lot of my classmates at St. Rose, so I never kept in touch with any of them except for one, and she kept in touch with a couple of others, and she died when we were 30. And so after that, I just didn't keep in touch with any of my grade school. Well, I did meet a couple of them once or twice at Marquette. You.
So we're wondering, do you have any strong experiences or important memories of the civil rights movement in general?
Okay, well, my heroine was Rosa Parks. I really liked her attitude, sitting on the bus and letting the guy who should have been getting up for her, had the roles been reversed, and not giving him the seat. I am not a fan of treating people differently for any bad reason. You can treat them differently for good reasons. If you already know they're a jerk, avoid them. If they're just people, they're just people. I have friends who are a lot of different backgrounds. And my daughter-in-law is Chinese, which makes my grandson half Chinese, which he informed me when he was 3 years old. And then I asked him, what's the other half? And he was at a loss, but he was 3 years old. And then he tried to teach me a few words in Chinese. I have friends who are African American. I have friends who are Hispanic. I have a lot of friends who are neither of those, but are here from a variety of countries that they've come here. I have my own mixed background. Polish was not a good thing to be when I was in grade school, and I had friends who told me that only us Irish were smart. And of course, my last name then was Irish. And I said, oh, really? Yeah. But do I remember the riots? Yes. Do I remember what went on in the city? Also, yes. By the time those were there, I was married. My husband was a scuba diver, which has nothing to do with the riots exactly, except that the place he went to get his tanks filled and to do some teaching with the people that were there was on 13th Street near Valete. And they sat up with a shotgun on various nights when they were afraid that people were going to attack their business, and never had to use the shotgun, fortunately. I remember hearing the I Have a Dream speech, which said a lot of things to that people should live by, and they really ought to have listened carefully, and obviously with some of what's been going on more recently, they didn't listen real carefully. There's too much hate and too little cooperation in the world, and it always has been. Toward that end, I did something that I don't usually do, and that is I made a New Year's resolution last January. And my resolution was to do something nice for somebody. I didn't have to know them. I didn't have to know anything about them. But it could be as little as opening a door or holding a door for somebody, or as much, it could be a lot more than that. I found that was a great resolution, and I invite any of you who need one to use that one, because you can really keep doing it. I broke my back in May, and which is why I'm wearing the brace, because I can't control how long I'm here or for what. I'm getting out of it now. But I've had so many people be so nice to me, and I have continued with my resolution. I wanted to do it every day. I didn't make it to every day, but I've made it to a lot of days. And I personally think it's one of the resolutions a lot of people should make, and the world would be better. Where are we going with this?
Do you remember the atmosphere in Milwaukee during the riots?
Oh, it was polarized. There were people who really were not in tune with the fact that there was wrong being done. Now, we had a duplex and we owned it. And we had people who lived in it until, from the time I was 3 until after I was married. And when my parents had to rent the downstairs, they had applicants of varying backgrounds. And they actually rented to a young African American, and that actually paid a dividend later, because when that young man and his family were moving out, there was also Super America was buying property to put that station that's boarded up now, and my parents sold to them at exactly the moment that the young African American family was moving out. They had a couple of kids by then. It was getting a little crowded. And they moved out maybe a week before my mom and dad did. And although there was looting other places in the neighborhood, nobody touched their house. When you treat people decently, they treat you decently. It really works. It was looted after they sold it. We found out about that.
So certainly there's a lot of violence. Did you, and this is a town, I don't know, did you have a TV at the time?
Yes.
And so I'm sure you saw a lot of the events going on TV, or?
Yes. And we had some protesters who came up. I live near Calumet and Lake Drive, and they were at Thorn Lane, at the edge of Lake Drive and Thorn Lane, which is kitty corner across the street from me, more or less. And they were out there protesting, but the Fox Point police did not let them go into Thorn Lane. They had to stay on Lake Drive. There was a businessman who lived there, and they were protesting how he ran his business. And my mother-in-law said to me, "What do you think you should do about that?" And I said, "Make them lemonade." So she didn't like that. But it touched everywhere. We were restricted to be inside our houses at various times. And of course, we knew there wasn't anything very violent going on where we were, but we knew people who were in the middle of it.
Now, after the riots, I'm sure it took a while, I guess, for that, for the city to come back together. I mean, was it
I'm
hard?
not sure it's together now.
No. How long do you think it took for the city to get past the events of the riots?
Oh, boy, I don't remember. It was a pretty fair time. There were people who boycotted being in the city. I did not drive until my son was 3 years old. So when I wanted to go down to my mom's house, we had a reliable city bus. It doesn't run on Lake Drive anymore, but it did then. And we would ride down there, and we'd get on the 3rd Street bus and go over to the either Wisconsin Avenue or Michigan and get on a bus to go down to 35th Street. And my friends in Fox Point, many of them thought I was absolutely crazy to be taking my son on a bus with that many African American people on the bus. Now, my son didn't have that attitude. He was 2, 3 years old, and if he saw a family with a 2 or 3 year old, or approximately, he'd be chatting them up. So, and that was where I wanted him to go, because that's where I see the future is working together. And I think that's something you're probably getting out of Marquette, and I know it's something that was commonplace at Dominican.
During a lot of the marches and stuff, and especially on TV, I don't know, did you hear anything about Father Grappi?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, he was front and center, and took a nice hike across the 16th Street Viaduct. And I always kind of regretted that there wasn't a black man doing that. However, there was a man doing it, so that was a good thing.
We'd like to kind of go into your teaching career. So where did you teach?
First of all, I taught at Marquette U for a little while as an assistant instructor, and as an instructor. And mostly I taught calculus there. I did teach some trig and college algebra 1 year. And then I retired after I got married, and I had my favorite son, who's my only child. And I stayed home with him until his freshman year in high school. And at that time, I had met somebody for whom I did some tutoring. And every dollar that they gave me for tutoring, I put into my fund to get my accreditation for teaching. And so when I got that, I taught short time at St. Eugene's School for a few weeks while they were trying to replace the elusive math teacher for junior high. They had one who quit in October. They had a series of subs. I think they had at least, those kids had, in that year, had at least 6 or 7 teachers. So after Christmas, when the most recent one had quit, Sister Principal came and asked me if I would take over for a while, and I said, yeah, but I have set up with Dominican High School, and I am going to be teaching there as of whatever day it was. And so when I walked into the classroom and they saw yet another face they weren't really familiar with, the kids all asked me, are you going to be our teacher? And I had to tell them, no, I'm not, but I negotiated with the principal. I said, as soon as I know something, I'm going to be telling the kids. So when they hired somebody, I was the one who let them know they were going to get a permanent teacher. And St. Eugene hired me for a couple of days to supervise him and make sure that he was really as good as they thought he was. He stayed for the rest of the year. I didn't stay for both of those days. I told Sister Principal that he didn't need my supervision. He was going to be fine.
What about your time at Dominican High School? How did the students change from when you started and then until you finished?
The biggest change was probably quantity. I don't attribute this to me. I attribute it to the fact that there were fewer students available, but the population went straight down. And we went from having roughly 850 to 900 students to about 300 now. I do keep in touch with them. I had really nice classes. Discipline was pretty easy most of the time. I had 3 students whom I really did not like, and they were all in one class, all in 1 year, and they played silly games. Their goal in life that year was to see if they could get a teacher or more to quit. They did get one to quit. She was a friend of mine. She quit at midterm. They were really nasty kids. They would get me so mad that I practically couldn't function. So I made up 3 little detention slips, one with each name, and I had everything on it except the date. I knew what they were going to do. They were going to mess up the class. I knew who they were. They were doing that on a regular basis. And so one day it was my class's turn to have an uproar, I guess. But one of them was really obnoxious, and so I handed him the pass. All I had to do was put on the date. I didn't have to have any, I didn't give him stage time, and that's what he wanted. So he came up after class, and he asked me, how did I do that so fast? I said, I had it pre-made. He says, how did you know it was going to be me? I said, I didn't. I had 3 passes made up, and it could have been any one of you. And don't even consider it, that you are out of the woods because I used that pass. I have another one prepared for you. He did not do anything, nor did the other 2. For the remainder of that class year, this was probably about February, until the very last day when I could no longer give them a detention or anything like that, when they brought water balloons. And the young gentleman who came up to me after class took and did that when my back was turned. You know, you're doing a math problem on the board. And of course, he waited until there was somebody in the hallway and then told that kid to run. And the kid ran and was out of sight by the time I could get to the door, and he claimed it came in from outside. Well, I knew better than that. And so I thought, well, I don't want to turn my back, but I think I have to. So I did, and I turned back very quickly, and then the second one was rolling a water balloon down the aisle. So I invited him to stay after class. And he cleaned up his mess. And then I said, well, there's more over there. And he said, but I didn't do that. And I just said, give me a name. He chose not to give me a name, and he cleaned it up. Now, I didn't care about that. He didn't have time for lunch. I basically didn't have time for lunch. And he asked me if I'd take him to the library and give him a pass to the library. I wasn't giving him a pass to anywhere. I took him to the library. And he went in there. He didn't go to lunch. I went downstairs and slugged down a little carton of milk and went back to class. Heard nothing more about that until the next year. These kids were juniors, and they were getting ready to graduate, and we had a tradition at Dominican where we had a faculty-student banquet. And my friend who shot the first water balloon was the MC, and he hadn't heard the rest of the story from his friend. So he told it as far as I told you, except that he didn't know that the friend had cleaned it up. And then he snarkily talked to me and said, tell me, Mrs. Lachenmann, when did you ever figure it out? And he gave me the floor, which was stupid of him, but that's him. And so I said, well, you should have told the rest of the story. I said, Bob cleaned up his, and then he wouldn't give me your name, but he cleaned up yours too. And so when do you think I figured it out? The senior class stood and applauded. They were so sick of these boys interrupting their classes that they were on the side of a teacher. My colleagues were amazed. I was kind of stunned. and a good time was had by me. Poor kid who had done the cleaning up, his face turned brilliant red. Those are my 3 verse students.
How long did you teach at Dominican High School?
How?
How long?
How long? 22 and a fraction years.
Okay. And then did you do any other jobs after Dominican?
I am an election inspector. I did some volunteering at the Adult Learning Center, which is on Vel Phillips Drive and I can't think of the cross street, but it used to be 4th and whatever. That was for people who didn't get through high school, needed a GED, and I was obviously teaching math there too. So that was an unpaid job, that was pure volunteerism, and I really enjoyed it, and I liked the people who worked very hard to get that GED, and a number of them went on to college. So it was worth my time. Recently, there have not been very many people there, so I quit. And besides which, the person I rode down with was quitting too.
Certainly, Milwaukee, it's changed a lot, and now currently you live in, you said Fox Point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything, looking, I guess, from with an outside view of the city, some of the things that you think have changed considerably, I guess, and things that you would want to change considerably, especially, you have that outside view of the city?
I still regard it as my city.
Yeah.
I grew up in it. I lived most of my life in Fox Point, and the first 26 years I lived at home in Milwaukee, but I still regard it as my city. I would like to see somebody who has a lot more money than I do come in and adopt a block or something, however much they could. And I do contribute to some things that work like that, like Habitat for Humanity. I'd like to see the housing improved. I would certainly like to see the education improved. I had an idea, but it's never come to the sight of anybody who could do anything much about it, that it would be a really good idea if when somebody, a family had their first child, that they provide them with some coaching for how to get that kid to a good start. Because you can work from a good start, but you can't work very well from a bad start. It takes too long to get the kids to where they're really school ready. They did a little of that with the Head Start programs, and very promptly, and that was too late as far as I was concerned. They were taking in 4-year-olds. I wanted them to do that with 4-day-olds. And very promptly, the people who had money started in to have K4 and K5 and obliterate any Head Start that these kids were actually getting. I want somebody to intervene very early, because I think that you could just change the world doing that. But nobody listens.
Well, Mrs. Overberry, we want to thank you very much for doing this. We appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you would like to add in this oral history?
I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. And I think you're going to have fun editing. There's a lot of things you can take out. I don't know how long your finished product has to be, but I know you've done more than what you're going to be able to use.
Well, thank you again, and I hope you have a good day.
You are welcome, and I have enjoyed meeting all of you. Of course, I enjoyed meeting Dan a lot earlier than the rest of you. I think it's been great. My grandson is right now doing a similar kind of project on a lesser scale. He's only in the 8th grade. And he has agreed not to interview me because he has another grandmother, so he's interviewing her. She didn't have such an opportunity as I had. I think this has been great. I haven't been in Marquette High School since my son graduated in '84.